You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me, the show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. So are we cannibals now, or... It's been 3 weeks of siege, and already people are eating the dead. You saw it this morning. 2 men dragging a corpse into an alley. You didn't have to follow them to know what they were going to do with it. You saw the hunger, the desperation stamped on their faces. You think you know one of them, the man who used to sell you olives from Sicily, a man with a wife and 2 daughters, none of which have been seen in weeks. You kept your head down then and hurried on your way, averted your eyes and pretended not to see what you saw, safer that way, for any who dared walk the streets of Rome these days. Today you are out on the streets again, and all is deserted. You make your way to the water fountain in the center of a square surrounded by towering insulae. You draw the water you need. You've heard rumors that some of the barbarians outside the gates have gone into the hills for the purpose of destroying the aqueducts, because while hunger will break a city, thirst will break it faster. Thus far, the water still flows. Thank the gods. You say a quick prayer beneath your breath, to Jupiter, and then the rest on down. While you say it, you glance around to make sure no one is listening. It's a seditious act now, and has been for a long time. It's illegal in Rome to worship the old gods. Years ago, the Christian priests and bishops gave orders for the temples to be shut, for the smoke to cease rising from the great sacrificial altars. No hanging of wreaths, no veneration of statues. It is treason now to make even a small burnt offering in your own home to your own household gods. The punishments are severe. But the barbarians are just outside. You don't know what they want. They are mysterious and unknowable and violent. But last week you heard a rumor that astonished you. The rumors say they are Christian too. There are those who believe the barbarians were sent by the old gods in vengeance for being driven out of their own city. You've never seen anything cow the bishops, but that rumor did. They almost allowed worship of the old gods again, the true gods, but only in private homes. When the people demanded the fires be lit on the ancient altars, the bishops refused. And so now the altars stay silent and the temples stay locked, and you remain hiding your worship from your neighbors, and the barbarians remain outside the gates. You pass the market on the way home. Once the city square was packed full of vendors, but now it is nearly empty. There is one stall open, selling bread green with mold. The line is down the street and around the block. You hear the price they are charging and you flinch. Easily a month's pay for a day laborer for one loaf of moldy bread. Who would pay that? Halfway home, you pass one of the gates, locked and bolted, but here you can hear the barbarians, the undifferentiated roar of tens of thousands of violent men just beyond that door. For an instant you can walk no more. You halt in the street, overcome by despair. You put down your water jug. Precious water sloshes at your feet. When will it end? Not even the gods know. But even you, who has never been God-touched, even you can see how it will end. The city has turned its back on its gods, and in return, the gods have abandoned the city and left you all to the mercy of the Christians, the ones without and the ones within. You have never felt more alone. For a moment you halt in the street. You close your eyes as the fear washes over you. For yourself, for your family, for all that you love that must burn even though you are blameless. Who will hear your prayers now? Who will listen to the prayers and the pleas of this city? The old gods are gone, and the new one is without pity. He may even be on the barbarian side. They are his children too. You are quiet for only a moment. To look at you, your neighbors would only see a tired old woman taking a moment of rest. They cannot see your seditious thoughts as you lift up your jug and continue on your way, the only way you know how, one step at a time on the broken cobblestones. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl,
The lighthearted summer beach blockbuster edition.
It's a lighthearted story for children.
For children and small pets who love stories that end well.
That's right, because all stories end well here on Ancient History Fangirl.
Yeah, we're lying liar faces. It happens.
We are lying liars who lie to you. The year was 410 AD, Jen. Alaric of the Visigoths was rampaging down the Italian peninsula, sacking cities, pillaging the countryside, and bearing down on the city of Rome.
As he was wont to do. This
is absolutely the same rant I get when I've had too many beers at the bar. That's why it sounds familiar, you guys. The great general Stilicho, his longtime nemesis, was dead. The Romans were depleted and exhausted due to decades of war. No one could stop Alaric. Inside the city of Rome, people were panicking. As the Goths encircled the city and blockaded the ports, the people inside began to starve. Soon they were eating their emergency grain stores, the rats, their own dead. Paranoia gripped the streets, and the cost of food, if it could be found in any of the markets, skyrocketed.
Rome was a Christian city by now. For the past 30 years, all paganism in the city was banned, publicly and privately. No blood sacrifices, no votive candles or burning lamps in the honor of a pagan god, no hanging of wreaths, no veneration of statues. You couldn't even tie a ribbon around a tree or make a burnt offering to your own household gods in the privacy of your own home. That was a treason-level offense. But as Alaric's siege ground on, people started whispering that the reason they were suffering so was that they had abandoned the old ways. The pagan gods were angry. This was their destruction. Because of this, Pope Innocent I even agreed to allow pagan rituals again, as long as they were done in the privacy of your own home. But the pagan priests said that the gods would only accept public sacrifices in the Roman Forum, and the Christians didn't want that. So the sacrifices were not done, and the gods were never appeased. And I will just stop here for a minute. If you haven't followed us on Patreon, I've done a whole series about Vestal Virgins and the goddess Vesta. And this is a time period where I can see the pagan priests and priestesses being like, you got to get back on Vesta's good side. You think she's one thing, but she's something else. Rome will fall.
For decades after Alaric's sacking, the Christian fathers tried to make sense of it. They could not let this be the narrative, that the sack of Rome was the pagan god's revenge for an empire's turn to Christianity. For decades, they struggled with what exactly it meant that God had allowed the newly Christianized city of Rome to be sacked by other Christians, no less. Look, when it was pagans attacking Christians, the message was clear. Pagans were the worst. And when it was Christians attacking pagans, clearly that was a righteous war of conversion. But just what was God trying to say by sending a Christian horde of barbarians against a Christian city and letting the barbarians win, but only after enacting a level of violence on the other Christians that was distinctly un-Christian? It's a mindfuck.
Yeah. It was here that some early Christian authors describe Alaric's sack of Rome as a kinder, gentler sacking, in which barbarian warriors did things like sparing the pious and escorting Christian ladies to safety with their arms full of loot unplundered. They needed to figure out how to frame this sacking in a narrative where the Christians, Goths, still kind of looked like the good guys, so as not to reflect badly on their Christianity. But the other Christians, in this case the Romans, weren't being punished by their forsaken pagan gods, right? Like, so it's super important here that both sides of Christianity don't look like it's Christian on Christian violence, right? It's got to be something else. The invading barbarians, who are also Christian, have to be good to the pious Christians. Otherwise, what's going on with the Christian God? This doesn't make any sense. We can't do the mental gymnastics around it.
Exactly. How could the Christian God allow this to happen? Because Christianity was supposed to be a religion of peace, like that's the narrative. I'm not saying it was. I'm just saying that's the narrative they all really heavily pushed, right?
Exactly. And so it must be that if you were a good Christian, then these other Christians, they were not going to loot and plunder and rape and pillage you. Oh, no. They're only going to do that to the people who've secretly been worshiping the barbarians or been bad Christians.
Right. So then you could frame this whole thing as retribution against bad Christians within Rome. See how that works? For not being Christian enough or holding on to the pagan ways.
Exactly. It's a punishment maybe sent down by the one true God on high to smote those who have been bad and actually make Rome a pious city now.
Yes, it's a smotening.
That is one way to interpret it. There are obviously other ways. We're not going to get into them. We're just giving you this one way.
But what's wild about this story, in my opinion, and probably in other people's opinion too, is that the Goths were Christian by now. That is wild in and of itself. And they weren't recent converts either. They had all been Christian for over 160 years. Theirs was the earliest conversion of a Germanic people in recorded history, and their Christianity was different than the state religion of Rome. It was a sect called Arianism. Okay, so before we get too far into the history and the details of this, I'm going to have to address the elephant in the room here. What do we mean when we say Aryan Christian? And I can hear a lot of you asking to yourselves, is that like a white supremacy thing? Is that like Nazis or something? So, Arianism with a Y, Aryanism, is an ideology of white supremacy that's associated with the Nazis. The ideology states that the Aryan race, which is white people, Germans, are a superior race destined to rule over their inferiors. This is a hugely damaging ideology that has been used to justify the genocide of millions of people. And the history it's based on, quote unquote, is hugely pseudo-historical.
The Nazis were not the first to come up with Aryanism. It has its roots in the 19th century. The word Aryan itself is appropriated from ancient Sanskrit term that refers to Indo-Iranian peoples. So, that's Aryanism with a Y, the one related to Nazism and white supremacy. The Aryanism we're talking about here is Arianism with an I, spelled Arianism. Aryan Christianity is rather unfortunately named, it turns out, but it's not related to Arianism with a Y as far as we can tell. Aryan Christianity, the kind of Christianity that most of the Goths converted to, was a branch of early Christianity named after a guy called Arius, its founder. He was a Christian ascetic and presbyter, a kind of early bishop. He was from Syria and he lived from the 250s to the 330s AD.
So, Arius was an early Christian thinker from a time when Christianity was still trying to figure out what it believed. Like, Christianity was still doing its foundational world building during this time. In the centuries after, one group would eventually gain dominance, and the other groups would become labeled as heretics and generally fade into obscurity, often after vicious persecution. I guess maybe two groups. Orthodox Christianity also has, millions of followers. But at this point, a lot of things we think of as canon now were very up in the air. Arian Christianity was one of those groups that did not end up gaining dominance. It arose as Christianity was still doing some of its foundational world building, when people were asking themselves pressing questions like, so, is Jesus like flesh and blood, or is he made of the same stuff as God? And so are we cannibals now, or... So, here's the type of philosophical conversation the Arians were mulling over.
So we all agree that Jesus is the Son of God, right? But, is he actually God or a permutation of God? Is he part God, the Son of God, or actually God in a human shell?
Or is he like a normal human with a special relationship to God?
Was Jesus a creature like you and me, a mortal, or was he also a God? Was he always a God, or does he only become God after he's crucified? Or was he also God, but does he only become super divine after crucifixion?
Or is he a God, but not the same God as God?
Or made of the same godly material as God, but also not that God?
Right. Like, what is Jesus made of exactly? What is God made of anyway? What is that? And what about the Holy Ghost? Like, what is that?
Where does everyone in the Holy Trinity rank in their hierarchy, right? Like, does it go God and then Jesus and then the Holy Ghost, or vice versa? Or are they all the same thing? So, Jenny, like, having grown up Catholic, like, I know one of the big things between modern Christianity and Catholicism is, like, Catholics believe that, like, when you eat the Eucharist and drink the sacramental wine, that you're actually eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus. Is that a question they were asking here, or is that like something that came along later?
I don't know the history of that question, really. Like, I'm not going to get into it too deep, but that is a different question than the questions that the Arians are mulling over here that I'm trying to illustrate. The Arians are really, at least as far as I can tell, mainly concerned with whether Jesus is part of God or is the same thing as God or not.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out whether or not they have like a monotheistic religion or they have a polytheistic religion, because if Jesus is not the same as God, then technically they have maybe 2 or 3 gods if you include the Holy Spirit.
I think that's really the heart of it, yes. The question about whether or not we're cannibals is a different question.
Kraft Mac and Cheese is better than 90s hip-hop. We'll remind you of your childhood without making you feel incredibly old. Kraft Mac and Cheese. Best thing ever.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
So, these were all the urgent questions the Arians were wrestling with in the 4th century AD. There were different versions of Arianism at different times, so it's hard to say what they believed in a single, simple, comprehensive sort of sentence. But the general gist seems to be that Arians believed that Jesus was not the same thing as God. He was created by God out of different material. Ideas about Jesus' nature ranged from an ordinary human with a special relationship with God to the next thing to divine but still created by God and not the same as God himself. In centuries after Catholicism came to be dominant, Arianism came to be seen as a despised heresy. Arian Christians were accused of, quote, denying the divinity of Christ. They were also accused of being polytheists, in that they believed the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost were 3 separate beings. But that's a Catholic lens, and the Catholics were a lot less tolerant than Arians theoretically. I mean, it goes back and forth, but let's say that for now.
Anyway, so Arians were, according to Catholics, idolaters who believed in polytheism, as Jen said. They worshipped 3 gods, 3. Sacrilege to practicing Catholics who, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my sense of things as a heathen, came to believe that God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost were 3 sides of the same thing.
I think so. Like, that's still confusing to me now as someone who grew up in that religion. But yeah, in theory.
Right. And I might be just horrifically oversimplifying. I am not Catholic myself. They're just trying to explain this in a way people get.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. Like, we're not teaching you the fundamentals of this religion. We're just giving you an idea of what some of the theological, ideological arguments were at this time that created schisms. So, like, don't add us.
Anyway, back to the Arians. To them, it was actually sacrilege to suggest that God suffered. I think that's one of the driving motivations that they had in defining God and Jesus the way that they did. In addition to trying to figure out if they were polytheistic or not, they had a problem with this idea of God having suffered. Because how could an all-powerful God suffer? And if God was Jesus, if God was the same thing as Jesus, that means he must have suffered because Jesus suffered. Saying God was the same as Jesus was like saying God was less than all-powerful, maybe even mortal, which is a dangerously sacrilegious thing to think, according to the Arians, right? So to them, the Catholics were being sacrilegious. At least that's what I'm picking up.
Yeah, and from a different standpoint, possibly a more modern Christian, not necessarily just Catholic lens, the idea that Jesus suffered and died for our sins is how we get salvation. So if he didn't suffer when he was on earth as a mortal before he ascends into heaven and becomes a god, from that theology, I can see where that's the problem, right? It's like if he did suffer, it's like, but how can he be a god? God doesn't suffer. But on the other side, if he doesn't suffer, then how can he redeem us? It's wild, right?
And it's a hole in their world building.
It really is. And it's this hole wherein you have this moment where you can open that door and be like, okay, but you can't have an all-powerful, almighty God who suffers. But you also can't have a God who redeems everyone through suffering if you don't have that. And one of the main dogmas that you have here, particularly in early Christianity and later Christianity, is this idea that you suffer for your faith. And that is a narrative they wove into how they essentially get their dominance.
That seems to be what's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, because, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the way in which Christianity grew had a lot to do with being a martyr. It wasn't necessarily about overpowering through sort of a colonial expansion the way Rome did, although that does happen. But a lot of stuff happened because of being Christian at people, martyring yourself.
Yeah, I would say that it definitely is about evangelizing, which is a form of colonization.
Yes, I'm not saying that's not there. But I also think part of what makes the religion so useful to the patriarchy and to a hierarchical society is that it tells you if you suffer in this world, you get all the good things in the next world. So it's conditioning you to accept things that maybe you shouldn't.
Exactly.
One person believes like the suffering is key. The other people are like, you can't have suffering because God doesn't suffer. That's why, in a sense, Arianism, I can see why it died out, because in a way it makes it less hierarchical.
So how does Arianism make Christianity less hierarchical? Because I kind of read it as more hierarchical, but tell me more.
So at this time, Catholic Christianity was essentially setting the groundwork for a really hierarchical system and a really patriarchal system. So the idea of suffering and the idea of kind of having to accept this lot in life that you're given to live your truth within your religion, right, is about sort of keeping everyone in their roles in society. Arianism says, like, but God doesn't suffer. So why are you saying that our God suffered when he was on earth? He didn't. And so that kind of leaves the room here for a less hierarchical society, which would be super destabilizing if you want to use your religion to create a hierarchical society where everyone kind of has to stay in their lane.
That is such a smart point. I didn't even see that, but it is so true.
Is it? Is that smart?
Yes. Yes, it is.
It took a while to get there.
And it was worth it to ask you to clarify, because that's a really important point.
Well, it's destabilizing, right? Like, you know, the idea that the fundamental idea that like suffering is not something your God would do, therefore it didn't happen, is like, okay, but then why do we have to suffer?
Or it did happen, but Jesus isn't God, in which case you're kind of up against the same question, because if he isn't God, that means he didn't die for our sins, and that means that we're all, like, it blows up the entire foundational belief.
That means there's no salvation. You know, there's no salvation in the afterlife, because the promise of converting is that you'll go to heaven, you'll be saved, and in all good things, right? But if none of that happened, then what do you get in the next world? I don't know. I have no answers.
How are we going to subjugate the masses under that paradigm?
Exactly. We need to stamp out those pesky thoughts. And that was a thing they could do because particularly in the Catholic religion at this time, most people couldn't read the scriptures. The scriptures were potentially still being written down. There weren't formalized books like we think of them now. Like there's a lot of stuff yet to come that would turn the whole religion on its head, but that's way in the future.
Yeah. So eventually, as you can see, Arianism came to be considered a heresy by the Catholic Church, But it wasn't always. It arose in popularity before Christianity was solidly defined. Christianity was a fringe minority religion for its first few centuries of existence in the Roman Empire. Off and on, for its history, Christianity was illegal. It was formally decriminalized by Constantine the Great in 313 AD in the Edict of Milan.
After that, Christian bishops from all over the empire met to hammer out their theological differences. Arius was a prominent voice in some of these early councils, and his Arian Christianity was a topic of debate at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. That council ended with the Nicene Creed, which was explicitly anti-Arian and pointed the way toward Rome becoming a Catholic empire. So Arius lost that debate, and I just love it because I know the Nicene Creed. I'm not going to go into it, but as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, I know that from religion.
Yeah, so did you know before that the Nicene Creed was explicitly anti-Arian?
I did not know that. It's really wild learning about this time in history because I very much have a lens from what I grew up in. But also, that was more based in a belief system, and seeing it both as a belief system, which is always going to be in the back of my brain, but also as a historical time period where all of these events were happening and, the world was changing and moving in different directions. It blows my brain every single time.
Yeah, it's so interesting to talk about this with you because I feel like we come at it, you have this sort of doorway in that I don't have. So it's always interesting to hear your perspective on this.
I feel also like I'm a little broken sometimes when I talk about it because it is difficult to explain some of the stuff that I grew up believing. I still have a very complicated relationship with, as most lapsed Catholics do, to someone who didn't grow up knowing it. And also, there is this kind of feeling with early Christianity, at least from my perspective, that I didn't need to dig into the history of the time period too much because, it's all Jesus time, it's so long ago.
They don't want you to dig into it too much, Jen, because if you dig into it too much, you start to see where people were actually figuring things out and hammering them out. And if they had to hammer them out, that means that it wasn't just one single uninterrupted truth passed down from on high. It means it was a bunch of people arguing about things.
Absolutely. And of course it would be that because they're figuring out what their religion is and because
fantasy world building, that's what they're doing.
Absolutely. And as I keep mentioning, things were being written down, sometimes copied over to be preserved because we don't have printing presses. Things are not being written down necessarily in the same language. Things are changing all the time. And when you think about that, it's but how could that be?
Well, what's fun is that Ulfilas actually wrote a Bible in Gothic so he could bring the word of God to the Goths, but he had to invent his own alphabet for that. So I don't know how widely read this would have been or was intended to be.
Exactly. And it's we talked about this in an earlier episode, for a long time, most of this stuff would have been written in Latin, which most average people after the fall of Rome wouldn't have been able to read. So they were trusting someone else to tell them what the word of God was. To me, it's just fascinating and so very different from how we see and consume things today. Anyway, let's get back to the ancient world. However, the Second Ecumenical Council of 381 put in place a specific carve-out for the Goths to practice Arianism. It said, quote, "The churches of God among the barbarian peoples are to be governed in the manner that already existed among their forefathers. And this may have given the Goths a tacit permission to be Arian that other populations in the Roman Empire didn't get." But Arianism wasn't always fringe in Rome either. Some of the emperors, like Valens, were Arian Christians, even decades after the Nicene Creed came out. And as the Goths established their own kingdoms within Rome, Arianism thrived. It didn't fully die out until the late 500s AD, when the Ostrogothic kingdom fell and the Visigoths were converted to Catholicism. That's a long time.
So I don't want to give the impression here that all the Goths were Arian Christians. The Goths were not a monolith. There were Catholic Goths, Goths who followed other Christian sects, and pagan Goths. Many of the Gothic people who lived far from Roman borders were probably not very well documented in terms of what their religion and traditions were. And the reality on the ground from village to village could be very different from the actions of bishops and flashy saints as reported by church leaders with an agenda. But the reality is that a large population of Goths was Arian Christian. Why is that? I've seen some historians suggest that Arianism appealed to the Goths because it was a simpler and easier to understand type of Christianity. It was less abstract than what became Catholic Christianity, and it was also perhaps more similar to polytheism, which was the tradition the Goths were coming from. Although, the Romans were also coming from a polytheistic tradition, so I don't know.
I think it's because it was less hierarchical, which I don't know because I don't know the ins and outs of it, but to me, it feels that way by asking those questions that I never asked as a kid. But again, I also grew up much later into a very established religion.
I really think that's a really good point, though, Jen, because the Goths would have had maybe more of a view towards being the underdog in a society, and maybe they would have seen that potential for oppression in Catholic Christianity that the Romans maybe didn't want them to see, right? Like, if we all accept Catholic Christianity, then we're all screwed, and we're all under this system. But if we can be Arians, then that protects us a little bit.
Potentially. I mean, it's hard for me to break away from what I know from a very established religion to what might have been going on at this time period. To me, it feels like there's a neon sign, but, who knows? So others believe that the reason the Goths held on to Arian Christianity so hard was a sense of identity. Arianism allowed them to exist in an increasingly intolerant Christian world, where Christianity was the religion of power. In a sense, it allowed them to belong, but it was different enough from Catholicism that it gave them a sense of unique identity as well. But let's return to our original question. How did the Goths become Arian in particular? We don't know for sure, but there are 3 general theories out there. And the correct answer, or the most true answer maybe, could have been more than one of them or all 3 of them at the same time. So let's get into it, Jenny.
Yeah, so the 3 possibilities were Gothic raiders capturing Christian prisoners, lady prisoners, who then converted their captors.
With their magic lady bits.
That goes unsaid, but obviously it is with the magical Christian converting lady bits.
I need to make sure that everyone knows how magical they are.
Mine is magical. I don't know about yours.
Same.
Activity of individual Christians along the Danube borders, meeting with and converting Gothic communities. That's number 2. And number 3, specific people in history, such as Valens, Fritigern, and Ulfilas, propagating Arian Christianity. So great men doing great deeds, shall we say. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. And we're going to start with the one about the lady bits. So this section is about Ostrogotha and the Christian prisoners. It does sound like an orgy.
It does. Maybe it was. I hope it was a good one.
Aren't we intrigued now? It's tough trying to figure out exactly when the Goths became Christian. There are lots of conflicting theories that pin it to certain events in history. The reality is that it probably happened at different times to different communities of Goths who had different levels of contact with the Roman Empire or with early Christian evangelists. I mean, probably it had to do with early contact with the Roman Empire in some sense because the Romans became Christians first. Other than that, it's hard to tell.
So here's perhaps the earliest Gothic story, right? It suggests that the Goths were in the process of becoming Christian almost as soon as their contact with Rome started. In his Gothica, Jordanes gives us a long list of Amal ancestors, names that must have loomed large in Ostrogothic oral history and mythology. Some were real people, while others were probably mythical or even the names of gods, or pseudo-historical people, I'm assuming. One of those names, the earliest one we know, was a real person, and this was Ostrogotha. Ostrogotha lived around Rome's crisis of the 3rd century. This was a poorly documented time in Roman history that lasted roughly 50 years. It started with the assassination of noted child emperor Severus Alexander in 235 AD. During that crisis, Rome was beset by civil war, economic collapse, and invaders. At one point, the Roman government split into 3 distinct kingdoms. It ended when Diocletian took power in 284 AD.
Jordanes tells us that Ostrogotha was an Ostrogothic king, and that at some point he and his forces crossed the Danube and attacked Moesia and Thrace. Other ancient writers, such as Zosimus and Ammianus Marcellinus, give us accounts of this invasion that don't mention Ostrogotha, so for a long time, most modern historians thought he was mythical and Jordanes invented him. That was until a new document was discovered, the Scythica Vindobonensia, or Vienna fragment, probably by the Greek historian Dexippus of Athens. Fragments of this document, dating to the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 AD, were found in the National Library in Vienna, tucked in with a collection of other medieval Arab papers. It was a palimpsest, meaning that the original writing had been erased to make room for later writing. Careful analysis has revealed ancient writing that told the story of some very early Gothic invasions from the point of view of a writer who may have been an eyewitness or at least a contemporary of this time. The Scythica Vindobonensia documents several invasions. The one involving Ostrogotha occurred in 250 to 251 AD. What happened, the thumbnail version, is that Ostrogotha invaded the Roman provinces of Moesia and Thrace near the Black Sea because the Romans stopped paying them protection money. Damn it, I want my money.
Absolutely.
They stopped subscribing to the peace plan.
They stopped subscribing to their Patreon.
Exactly. The $5 level, we won't attack you.
The emperor at this point was Decius, but he hadn't been in power that long. His immediate predecessor, Philip the Arab, may have been a Christian or just a lot more tolerant than previous emperors to Christians, depending on the source. Either way, the city of Philippopolis, which the Goths sacked during this time, was heavily Christianized. It's said that the Goths carried away a lot of Christian prisoners during the sacking. Lady prisoners. This is vaguely alluded to in the sources, but the inference here is that a large number of Christian prisoners were taken by the Goths during this time, mostly women, and that they managed to convert their captors. We're not really sure how true this story is, but it's often pointed to as a seminal event that might have been a Gothic community's first sustained contact with Christianity.
So the second theory is border activity with the Romans, and this isn't like large-scale raids, more like just kind of peaceful exchange, like trading and talking and moving between communities and stuff like that. It may not have been one specific event that led to the Goths' conversion. It's possible that Roman conversion to Christianity was what fueled Gothic conversion to Christianity, as we've said, since they shared borders and there were so many Gothic immigrants in Rome anyway, and it was a gradual process, not an immediate one. This is Jenny Williamson from Ancient History Fangirl, here to tell you about my upcoming scorching romance novel, Enemy of My Dreams. In the last days of the Roman Empire, a desperate princess and a brutal Gothic warlord forged a dangerous alliance. Julia, only daughter of the Emperor of Rome, lives a life of excess and freedom. But when her father dies and her teenage brother takes the throne, he will stop at nothing to seize control of both the empire and his wayward sister. And now Alaric of the Visigoths, a ferocious warrior who has battled Rome for years, has come to the capital to bargain for his homeland. Realizing how perilous her position is, Julia impulsively turns to Alaric, the empire's sworn enemy, and the one man who can make Rome tremble. Best-selling author Elodie Harper says, quote, "This is a hugely entertaining Roman world romantasy with a hilarious heroine and smoldering hero whose adventures in love and war are set against the backdrop of the last dangerous days of an ancient empire. Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold."
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Christianity was recognized as its own unique religion in the Roman Empire as early as 98 AD, when the Emperor Nerva granted it a status separate from Judaism, meaning the Christians were exempt from paying special taxes that the Jews had to pay. The Christians did not assimilate easily in the Roman Empire, and one of the reasons is that they refused to worship the emperor as a god in his own state cult. A lot of early Christians were put to death for this reason.
The history of Christianity in Rome is a deep and complex topic that we're not going to get too into right now. There are whole podcasts about this, and we just can't do that right now. That's not really what this series is about.
We're trying to give you context, but also this is mainly about the Goths and their Christianity, not the Romans and their Christianity. But you do need some context.
Yes, exactly. You need context, but we're not doing a deep dive. But the reality is that between the 100s and 300s AD, Christianity was rising in popularity and spreading throughout Rome, despite the government's attempts to squelch it. It was particularly popular in the East, where it spread to frontier communities that came into contact with Goths, both in trade and war. Some Goths, like Ostrogotha, took Christian captives in large enough numbers to form their own diaspora communities that spread Christianity in their territory. Some probably took Christian women as bed slaves and even wives and had children with them and converted via that.
But also, Christian religious people, some Goths themselves or with mixed heritage, were active in these communities, spreading the religion anyway. They would have been particularly persuasive because of their shared culture. And the Goths also traded with Romans, lived among the Romans in border communities, joined the Roman military, were enslaved themselves to the Romans, and possibly vice versa sometimes, and interacted with them in all kinds of ways. The Goths in border towns and in the Roman Empire were also heavily culturally Romanized in other ways. That cultural package frequently involved Christianity. At times in history, Christianity was Rome's state religion, and Goths trying to succeed and make their way in Rome needed to convert to get ahead or sometimes just to survive, depending on when in history we're talking about. It's possible that the Goths picked up Christianity so early because that was when they started interacting with Rome.
And this is backed up by the archaeology. While some have assumed throughout the years that Christianity spread deep into Gothic territory, Christian artifacts in the ground, such as crosses inscribed on coins and jewelry, things like that, were found primarily near the borders with Rome, not deep into Gothic territory. As to why Arianism specifically, some point to communities of Homoians, an early group of Arian Christians, who were active in provinces along the Danube in the 200s and 300s AD. They could have played an outsized role in converting Goths in that area.
So let's take a look at the third theory, which is about great men doing great deeds.
Oh, that is always how history is written. Nobody else does anything.
No, only the great men.
With their great deeds.
That's right. The third theory is that specific men in particular were instrumental in spreading Arian Christianity, specifically Arian Christianity to the Goths. Some of those people are the Emperor Valens, who, as we mentioned, was an Arian Christian, and the Tervingi leader Fritigern. As Christianity spread among the Goths, not all were on board. Some tried to cling to their pagan traditions and stamp out Christianity in their own communities. And no wonder. We've seen how important the pagan religion was to the Goths. They based their whole ruling culture as great men who did great deeds as a form of ancestor worship that bolstered their ruling class. Why was Christianity so powerful that it could uproot such well-established traditions and ruling families? It's very hard to say, but I don't think it was like a bloodless and easy transition. The stories that we see on the ground corroborate that. Christianity must have taken root amidst profound societal upheaval for ordinary Goths, and the conversion, as we said, was not always nonviolent or smooth.
Sometimes it was the pagans who tried to violently purge the Christians from their communities. We have record of 2 events of anti-Christian persecutions among the Goths. One happened around 347 or 348 AD. It was done by Alaric of Reichs of the Tervingi Goths and a pagan. We know practically nothing about what happened, just that something did happen. And Alaric apparently instilled his fierce pagan values in his son, because the next person we hear about persecuting Christians is his son, the Gothic king Athanaric. Athanaric, like his father before him, was a Tervingi Reichs. There are accounts of him in several different ancient sources, including the Roman Christian historian and lawyer Sozomen, who lived from 400 to 450 AD. Ammianus Marcellinus, Jordanes, Orosius, and many others. The accounts of his life in different sources are somewhat contradictory, but this is the general picture.
Athanaric was a king of the Tervingi, and he was a pagan. At some point, he went to war against another Gothic leader, Fritigern. Fritigern, if you'll remember, was one of the Gothic kings who led the Tervingi over the Danube and into the starving camps in 376 AD. We've already told this story. He was the one who survived the assassination banquet, him and Alavivus. Or Alavivus didn't survive. We don't know what happened to Alavivus, remember? So those events took place a few years after what we're talking about right now. So this is before that. The events of this time that we're telling you right now, probably the 360s or early 370s AD. In this story, Athanaric and Fritigern are at war. And I'm not sure what the war was about. I don't know if it was about religion specifically or something else. We do know that whatever they were warring about, Fritigern sought out the assistance of Rome to deal with Athanaric. The Roman emperor at the time was Valens, and he sent reinforcements. With their help, Fritigern managed to win the war, and in gratitude, he converted to Valens' religion, Christianity. Arian Christianity. And Fritigern didn't just convert himself. he insisted that all of his people become Arian Christians too. Because that's what you do. If your king is an Arian Christian, then you are an Arian Christian. It is non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
Yes, we all agree on that. And this is a reason given for why so many of the Goths were Arian Christians, because of this deal that Fritigern did with Valens. I'm not sure if it was specifically transactional like this, or if he just did it in gratitude or what, but he wound up converting to Valens' religion because Valens helped him with this war with Athanaric.
Yeah, and I also think you have to understand that with Christianity in general, if you convert, you would have very strong feelings about wanting to share that with all of your friends and family and followers, right?
Well, we're getting to that, Jen. So, Fritigern didn't just convert himself. As we said, he demanded that all of his people became Arian Christians. And this is a reason given for why so many of the Goths were Arian Christians. So here's what happened next. According to some ancient sources, Fritigern's newly converted Goths started preaching to their friends and family. Not just their friends and family in Fritigern's camp, but also people they knew on Athanaric's side of the recent civil war.
And this is how Fritigern ultimately won his war against Athanaric. It's hard to say if he encouraged these conversions out of spite or true religious zeal, but it's said that Christianity spread so quickly among Athanaric's pagans that Athanaric started to feel that the Gothic religion, culture, and way of life were being threatened, so he persecuted the Christians in his territory. And here's how Sozomen, a Roman Christian historian and lawyer, describes the persecutions. Quote, Athanaric resented that his subjects had become Christian under the persuasion of Ophilus, and because they had abandoned the cult of their fathers, he subjected many individuals to many punishments. Some he put to death after they had been dragged before tribunals and had nobly confessed the doctrine, and others were slain without being permitted to utter a single word in their own defense.
So this quote that Jen just read mentions a specific Goth by name associated with these conversions, and we've discussed him before. He's a fascinating character because his life embodies all three of the mechanisms we just discussed about how Arian Christianity supposedly spread. Capture of Christian women, groups of pious preachers, and, people just traveling around among Gothic communities, then the acts of single, very influential individuals. His name was Ulfilas. He was the Arian Christian bishop who wrote the Ulfilas Bible, the Bible in Gothic. So Ulfilas is often widely credited with being a great man who did a lot to single-handedly spread Arian Christianity among the Goths. Some also say he was a Homoian, which I think is a specific sect of Arianism. I'm not exactly sure what they believed, but I think it was a type of Arianism. And when historians refer to Homoians being active along the Danube, they mean Ulfilas and his followers. That's what they mean.
Ulfilas, his name meant little wolf, was born in 311 AD. In what's now Romania. He was a descendant of Roman Christians from Cappadocia in Turkey, who had been captured by Visigoths in a raid around 264 or 267 AD. It is believed that Ulfilas' mom or grandmother was an Arian Christian. His dad was a pagan Goth, and that his mom, or possibly his grandma, was one of those Christian war captives who brought Christianity to the Goths. The captives and their descendants eventually formed their own Christian community within Gothic territory, and that's where Ulfilas grew up. The dominant culture was still Gothic and pagan. Ulfilas was basically a religious minority in a small community of Christians descended from captives, in possibly hostile pagan territory. It's actually not clear if he was a captive himself or just living in a community descended from captives, but he's a very good example of how Christianity propagated through Gothic culture, through captive communities like this one.
Almost nothing is known about Ulfilas' early life. We get a sense that he was educated because he was working as a lector in a church by age 30. That meant he had to read and translate services from Latin to Gothic, and it meant that as he grew older, there was a burgeoning Christian community that included churches and eventually grew large enough to need a bishop. Ulfilas was sent as an ambassador to Rome at some point, where he was consecrated as the Bishop of Gothia, so he bridged many worlds, pagan and Christian, and Roman and Goth. Ulfilas spoke Latin and Greek as well as Gothic. As a bishop, he traveled to Rome and Constantinople as a high-profile voice for Arian Christianity in some of the early Roman councils, trying to determine what Christians actually believed. He returned to Gothia in 341 AD, where he worked to convert Goths to Christianity, working in communities at the individual level. Some sources say he did this at the request of Fritigern, spreading Arian Christianity to Athanaric's people out of spite or religious zeal, I'm not sure which.
Two things can be true at once.
It's not mutually exclusive.
Exactly. One of the things he did to convert those people was translate the Bible into Gothic. The Ulfilas Bible is a fascinating document, and we've already told you a lot about it. It's the place where written Gothic is preserved, and the reason we know as much as we do about that language. But the Gothic in the Bible is crammed full of foreign words that may not have been in common usage in vernacular Gothic, not to mention its syntax is strongly Greek. An analysis of which words Ulfilas uses to translate certain concepts, and whether he used a Greek loanword, can tell us what were the most familiar concepts to a Gothic audience at the time, mainly agricultural words, and what they needed foreign loanwords for. And we get other interesting tidbits too.
For instance, Ulfilas created his own unique alphabet to write this Bible, borrowing liberally from the Greek alphabet and crafting his own runes to make sounds that weren't present in Greek. But he avoided using real old Futhark runes, possibly because he feared their pagan power. And he omitted the Book of Kings because it was too warlike, possibly to avoid inflaming the passions of the warlike audience he spoke to. Christianity was a religion of peace, after all, or at least that's what the Christians would like us to believe. The date usually given for this translation is around 369 AD, and while Ulfilas is generally given all the credit for translating the Bible, modern historians who've analyzed the text believe it was actually multiple people, perhaps a team of translators working under Ulfilas' supervision.
In a way, Ulfilas is a perfect living example of all the ways it's believed Christianity spread to the Goths, through Gothic raiders kidnapping Christian women, and through individual monks and preachers with strong connections in Gothic communities, making contacts and spreading the religion, and his connection to the great men who individually spread the religion. He has been identified as one of those individuals himself who did a lot of heavy lifting in spreading Arian Christianity to the Goths. But also, some sources say he was doing it at Fritigern's request, operating in pagan communities ruled by Athanaric. It's said that when Athanaric started his persecutions, Ulfilas had to flee to Roman provinces. Eventually, he traveled to the mountains near Nicopolis with a community of followers. Some 200 years later, a traveler wrote that that community was still there, living in Christian poverty in the mountains.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these early Christian accounts of pagan and Christian clashing in Gothic communities, because it really reveals a lot about how that process worked and how the Goths were potentially converted and how Christianity and paganism interacted in their villages. Christian writers give us a few accounts of life under Athanaric's persecutions, mostly in hagiographies of saints. You have to take these with a grain of salt, but there are a number of Gothic saints and martyrs that come from this time. Here's one such story. According to early Christian writers, in his effort to stamp out Christianity, Athanaric sent a henchman, Winguric, among the people of Crimea. Crimea, a peninsula in the Black Sea that's part of the Ukraine but is illegally being occupied by Russia at the moment, was an early stronghold of Gothic Christianity. Coins with Christian crosses on them have been discovered there as early as 311 AD, which I believe is the earliest time that Christian artifacts have been found among the Goths.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me wonder, right? Like, did these people get converted first? And if so, how? Because I don't believe that they bordered Rome. Anyway, that was about 67 years prior to Fritigern's conversion. These Goths were not Christians because of Fritigern, in other words, either. It came from somewhere else. Where is a mystery? Our third option is kidnapping Christian ladies, so maybe that happened.
That's definitely what happened.
Yeah, but anyway, around 375 AD, when Guric arrived in Crimea, determined to stamp out Christianity, he placed a wooden carved idol of a Gothic god in a chariot and paraded it into towns and villages and just watched what everybody did. He demanded it be worshipped, and those who refused to worship it were met with violence.
Finally, Winguric took the idol to a large tent that people were using as a church. He declared that everyone willing to worship the idol would be spared, but that those who refused would experience a terrible fate. Many people in the tent obediently worshipped the idol, but about 308 refused. It must have been a very big tent.
Like a revival tent of some kind.
Like a circus tent.
Right.
Winguric set the tent on fire, and all 308 Christians were burned alive. Men, women, including pregnant and nursing women with infants, and children. The names of 21 of these were preserved as martyrs, 11 laymen and 7 women, 3 clerics, 2 of their names were remembered, Wareka and Batwin, plus 4 children, the sons and daughters of Wareka and Batwin.
This must have been a very traumatic event to early Christians in Gothic Crimea. It's said that a Gothic princess, Gotha, and her daughter Dulcilla took the remains of about 26 people from this event and had them buried at Cyzicus, a town in northwestern Turkey. So, we have this early picture of how pagan attempts to purge the Christians played out in one community, and it gives us this very early picture of Gothic communities in the late 200s and 300s AD experiencing a certain amount of religious upheaval as Christian and pagan religions struggled for dominance. However, the schism between Gothic and pagan may not have been so cut and dry in all places. Like anyone else, the Goths brought their own traditions and pagan outlook to their new religion. You can see this even in the Ulfilas Bible, in how the word for God was gopt, specifically a wooden idol. And this is a very Gothic, not Christian, way of conceiving God. It's quite possible that the Gothic version of Arian Christianity, especially as practiced in small villages, bore more resemblance to their former paganism than to a Christianity we'd recognize today. Douglas Boyne, in his book Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's View of the Fall of Rome, said, quote, "The Goths who converted during these years grafted Christianity's teachings onto practices that were largely familiar to them and, in the process, made the faith uniquely their own."
In fact, some Romans believed that the Christian Goths they encountered were only feigning their faith for that reason. The Greek philosopher Eunapius of Sardis, who lived from 347 to 420 AD, expressed deep suspicion that Gothic Christians were indeed faking it. Quote, "Each tribe had brought along from home its ancestral objects of worship together with their priests and priestesses, but they kept a deep and impenetrable silence upon these things and spoke not a word about their mysteries. Furthermore, they all claimed to be Christians, and some of their number they disguised as their bishops. And having dressed them up in that respected garb and having provided for them, as it were, a large fox-skin, they brought them forward. The barbarians used these devices to deceive the Romans, since they shrewdly observed that these things were respected amongst them, while the rest of the time, under cover of the deepest secrecy, they worshipped the holy objects of their native rites, with noble and guileless intent. Although the situation was such, the Romans had fallen into such folly that even those who appeared to be sensible persons were clearly and readily persuaded that they were Christians and bound by all Christian rites." So it's quite likely that in some Gothic villages, the priests who did the sacrificial rites were doing more or less the same thing under Christian rule that they did under pagan rule. They were keeping silence as if it were all a mystery cult, like all the other ancient religions. And they were using the same relics and rituals they used in their pagan religion, just giving it a nice Christian veneer, shall we say. A little gloss, a little glow up.
So this may not have gone against early Christianity per se. Christianity has a history of appropriating pagan holidays and rituals to help the religion spread, after all. I mean, that is a thing. And it's quite possible that on the ground level, among small, non-wealthy Gothic villages and farms, people went along worshipping the same gods and doing the same rituals they'd done for thousands of years, just calling it something else.
To me, that makes a lot of sense, because if you think about it, right, if so much of your calendar is tied to, like, these ancient rituals, like, even now, our moons, like, when we say the new moon or the corn moon or the harvest moon or the wolf moon, they're tied to, like, ancient things, right? And it's like, I know that it's time to plant or that the seas are navigable because of this ancient festival we have about the moon. If you lose that, you kind of lose all sense of time and space and an understanding of the world around you. So you kind of have to adapt it in some way, or else I think you'd break your brain.
Yeah.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
So let's talk about Sabas the Goth. So Sabas the Goth, we actually talked about him in a previous episode, but I did promise you I would give you more of the dirty details, and here I am, giving you more of the dirty details. So he was a Gothic saint. There are, as I've said, a number of Gothic saints who lived during the time of Gothic conversion to Christianity, and one of them is worth examining in more detail, in exhaustive detail, shall we say, as he supposedly lived among the Tervingi when Athanaric was trying to stamp out Christianity among the Goths. He lived this. And his story really shows how Christianity and paganism might have functioned alongside each other in a Gothic community.
Strap in, it's going to be fun. Sabas was born in what's now the Wallachia region of eastern Romania in around 334 AD in Gothic territory. He converted to Christianity as a young lad, and his hagiography claims he was a cantor or reader in his church. So he was literate and educated, like Ophelius, and he could read the language. Here's what his biographer says about him. Quote, "He was scrupulously chaste, that he shunned all conversation with women, except what was indispensable. He often spent whole days and nights in prayer, and devoted his whole life to exercises of penance, flying vainglory, and by words and example, inducing others to a love of virtue. He burned with an ardent desire in all things to glorify Jesus Christ."
Could not be normal around women.
Or anyone, really.
Right, or anyone, but especially women.
In the late 360s or early 370s, King Athanaric started enacting those persecutions against Christians at all levels of his Gothic society, including in small farming villages. It wasn't long before those persecutions came to the town where Sabas lived.
Sabas lived in a village that was mixed Christian and pagan. But the leaders were pagan, and it was probably the dominant religion there. According to the account, Athanaric's henchmen came to Sabas's village, and the tribal leaders welcomed them with a communal feast. During that feast, meat was served that had been sacrificed to the pagan gods. This meat was a trap. Everyone was supposed to eat it and prove their devotion to the pagan ancestral gods, or out themselves as Christian, because the Christians were not supposed to eat the pagan meat. But some pagans in the community had the bright idea to swap some of the sacrificed meat with non-sacrificed meat, so the Christians among them could eat it without either going against their religion or outing themselves. But Sabas was too pious for this. Too pious. Rejecting his friends' attempts to protect him, probably at risk to themselves, he stood up and loudly proclaimed that he was a Christian and he would not be eating any of that meat, thank you very much, not even the unconsecrated meat. And not only was he not going to eat the meat, but no other Christian in this town should dare to eat that meat, any meat, because if they did, they were renouncing their faith.
You're going straight to hell.
So he basically outed himself and all the other Christians. And he outed the pagans for trying to help him too.
Yeah, he kind of was just, he was really being dramatic. Very over the top and just so unnecessary.
Yes, and like not giving a shit about anyone around him.
Yeah, about the consequences for anyone else. People who are trying to help him practice his faith. He's just like, I need to blow this up because of me. So he was not executed, but he was temporarily exiled. In fact, he was exiled not by Athanaric's men, but by his own community, because he was that annoying about being a perfect Christian.
Athanaric's henchmen, reading between the lines here, they were not that jazzed about persecuting Christians. They were just, they were doing their job, checking a box. They're like, are there any Christians here? And the Christians are like, nope, no Christians here. And they're like, right, check the box, move on. And like, Sabas was like, no, I'm going to make an issue of this.
He's obsessed with being this very perfect Christian martyr. And that makes it really difficult, even if you're a Christian, to want to listen to this guy, because it's like, I get it. I will never be as good as you, Sabas. I'm on it. I get it. But I'm trying. And isn't this about forgiveness and peace? Come on, man. So eventually, Sabas returned from exile. And a while later, Athanaric's henchmen came back looking for Christians again. This time, they just outright asked, are there any Christians in this village? And the villagers all stood up and said, no, sir, no Christians here. They may have been willing to take the villagers at their word and move on. There's a reason to do that, right? If everyone is Christian, you kill them all, then you're not going to get anything out of that village, no tribute, no nothing, right? And it's kind of important for the continuation of the religion that most people who were practicing Christianity potentially in secret, that they not stand up and say, we are Christian, because then they will be all killed and the religion will not continue. So there's a lot of reasons not to stand up and be like, hey, however, Sabas was too pious to let this stand. He stood up and said, quote, let no one swear an oath on my behalf. I am a Christian. right at you.
Everyone's like, oh my God, do you have to?
To me, like, you know, again, I grew up, I had hagiographies of saints. I went to a Catholic school for a couple of years. Like, I very much was shown that, like, this is the thing to be envied, to be able to be martyred for a cause. But now that I'm on a different side of life, I'm like, yes, I get that. But the reality is, by him doing that, potentially he could have had all of these people in his village executed, and then the religion won't prosper either. Like, you have to have people who are practicing and able to get along with others.
I was not raised Catholic, so I'm an outsider. To me, I think the thing that strikes me as the most egregious is that he has absolutely no care for the safety of the people around him. He doesn't care that they're trying to protect him and putting themselves at risk. He's not thinking about other people. He's thinking about their immortal souls, right? He thinks it's just fine for them to be tortured and murdered in the here and now, as long as they go to heaven with their souls clean and still Christian and not disavowing their Christianity. So that's the motivation. And I kind of see that, like, I feel like you can certainly correct me, Jen. Like, I feel like somebody raised in the tradition would say, well, that's the most honorable position of all. To me, that's a position that justifies doing anything to anybody.
Yeah, and I think it's really tough because, again, that is the position I was raised in, and I totally get why it primes you to a lot of different things. And again, not everyone does genocide, but the point here is, as Jenny said, if the larger goal is saving your soul in the next life, then it does mean I have to do this because I don't want you burning in hell being tortured by demons forever.
On into infinity, right? And like, if that's what you think, then Sabbath, right? Weighing the eternal souls of everybody around here, like eternity lasts forever. Any momentary suffering on earth can't be stacked against that. Like, that's what he's weighing. But then again, that opens the door to justifying any atrocity.
And that's the problem. I also think for me, like I said, being a person who has now been a student of history for quite a long time, I always think about the people who are defenseless and who are trying to just live their lives, the women and the children who will be put to death for someone else's belief. As Jenny said, the pagans who are just trying to let the Christians live alongside them. They don't want to turn them in. Now you have this person who's like, I need to make this all about me and my belief. And it feels very different to me than what I was taught. I'm not going on the side of one or the other. I'm just saying, I know how I feel now. I know how I felt then. And it's wild.
Jen's got 2 dogs fighting inside of her.
At all times. It's like sometimes it's this giant German Shepherd versus this tiny little Yorkshire Terrier. But every once in a while, the full moon goes and the Yorkshire Terrier's like, haha, now I'm the same size as you. I'm a werewolf.
I don't know which one is the Catholic one.
You know, it doesn't matter. It could be any fight.
So one thing I want to note here is that even if you're going with the theory that you have to do this for everyone's immortal soul, that's still really being dismissive and contemptuous of the pagans in this community who specifically are trying to help Sabbath the Goth and other Christians, because they're going to hell anyway under that paradigm, right? Because they're pagan. So he's just letting them get tortured and punished for helping him and then thrown into the pit of hell early. Like, so he's really only, if you can generously extend him the assumption that he's operating under the care of the Christians' immortal souls, he's certainly not caring about the souls of anybody else.
But not only that, Jenny, let me go even one further. He's also, like, yes, doing that, but he's depriving the pagans, if you believe this, of the ability to continue to hear the word of Christ and to be converted by outing himself, right? By making this about him, he will not be around in the community. Other Christians won't be around in the community to continue spreading this religion to them. So, yeah, it's really dark.
He's acting so obnoxious about his Christianity that he's probably actively repelling people who might have been on the fence. They're like, God, I don't want to be like that guy.
Sabbath Magath, come on.
Okay, so anyway, what just happened is that Athanaric's henchmen were like, okay, guys, we have to check this box. Are there any Christians in your village? Nod, nod, wink, wink. And the people in the village are like, nope, no Christians here, no sir. And they're like, all right, thank you for confirming that. And they check their box. They're about to move out. And Sabbath the Goth stands up and he's like, wait. So that's what just happened. Sabbath's pagan neighbors and possibly some of his Christian neighbors then immediately leaped into action trying to protect him again, saying, oh, you know what? He was just a poor peasant, owning nothing but the shirt on his back. He's too poor to help or hinder anyone. And okay, sure, if you really want to get technical, there were no Christians in the village at all if you don't count that one guy, but he doesn't really count.
You know, I wonder because of their desire to protect him on just a different level that I've never thought about before. Everything else is valid. I'm not saying this is true. But I wonder if maybe Sabas might have had some mental impairments that they were like, we got to protect this guy because he very clearly doesn't understand how to get along in society.
I mean, I think that you could just say that of his religious fervor, even if he wasn't mentally impaired in other ways.
Yes, I think his religious fervor does border on that, but I wonder if, like, you know, there's something else in there as well, and they felt protective of him. I don't know. Again, I don't want to make assumptions because there's no evidence, and I am not a mental health professional, but it just feels like they were trying to look out for him.
Anyway, so it seems that this time Athanaric's soldiers agreed. They really did not want to punish this village. They just wanted to move on.
They wanted to go eat good meat somewhere else.
They're like, yeah, you know what? You're right. That guy, way too pathetic to do anything about. So we're just going to check the no Christians box. Anyway, it's fine. So they left without punishing him. But Sabas's own neighbors once again exiled him for not having the good sense to just shut up already. Oh my God. This exile did not last forever. And at some point, Sabas was allowed to come back. In the year 372, his friend Sansalis, a Roman priest, not a Gothic priest, came to visit him and celebrate Easter. 3 days later, the Gothic chieftain Atharid, who was another henchman of Athanaric's, arrived in the village with a large troop of soldiers, looking for Sansalis in particular and Christians in general because it looks like the last few shifts of guys just did not do a very thorough job. The soldiers dragged both men, both Sabas and Sansalis, out of their beds naked and marched them through the thorn bushes in rough territory, whipping and beating them the whole way. What were they doing in bed naked together?
Were they in the same bed? Because you do say their beds.
I mean, I don't know if they were in the same bed, but they were naked in bed. That's all I'm going to say.
I mean, depending on the time of year, they would have been, but yeah.
I mean, they would have been all Christian about it. Like, oh no, I mustn't, I shan't.
I kind of hope they were.
And then they get whipped through the thorn bushes by some burly soldiers. Oh, goodness.
I shan't, and yet. So Sabas pointed out to the soldiers that there was not a mark on his skin, despite this rough whip play. And that was because of his extreme piety and holiness. They were persecuting a holy man. Enraged, the henchmen looked around for a rack to torture him on, and not finding one, they tied him and Sansalis to a wagon wheel and had them whip some more. Naked, of course.
This is sacrilege. We are sacrileging right now.
We've already established I have no soul, so what's...
Right, and I've been a heathen the whole time, so...
So that night, an old woman snuck past the guards and set Sabas free. Instead of running away, he stuck around, helping the old woman make breakfast and washing the dishes in the morning, until Atharid's men came to arrest him and torture him again. Okay, I think he really likes the torture, guys. The day after that, they brought him sacrificial meat to eat. Sabas refused the meat. In fact, he told the men who brought it, soldiers of Atharid's, that they should just tell their boss to let them kill him already. And this pissed off one of the soldiers so much that he threw a pestle at Sabas so hard that everyone thought it had killed him. But it didn't leave a mark. Was this because he was a holy man? That's what the gossip said.
Atharid's men really also don't want to kill any Christians. They just don't. They're just like, could you just like...
Why are you making this so hard? That's what they said.
So when Atharid caught wind of this, he shrugged and said, okay, if he insists, and sentenced Sabas to death. He sent some of his soldiers to go and get Sabas and drown him in the river Massius, a tributary of the Danube. Sansalis was released. Sabas would not shut up the whole way there, I swear to God.
So did Sabas.
Yeah. The whole time he was praising God, talking about God, God this and God that, but also denigrating the soldiers' pagan religion, putting it down and telling them they were idolatrous villains who were going to hell. Rude. Sabas can't be in public around other people. He cannot integrate. That's his problem. The soldiers were just ordinary guys with a regular paycheck and families back home and probably a mortgage to pay. They did not want to drown this guy, as annoying as he was. As they dragged the increasingly verbally abusive Sabas toward the river, they debated among themselves. Look, this guy is clearly not in his right mind. Maybe instead of drowning him, we should let him go so that he can get the help he needs. I mean, if we let him go right here, Atharid will never find out. And even if he did, he probably wouldn't care, as long as the guy stays out of his hair, right?
This was when Sabas piped up and said, quote, "Why do you waste your time talking nonsense and not do what you were told to? For I see what you cannot see. Over there on the other side of the river, standing in glory, the saints who have come to receive me." The soldiers looked at each other and shrugged and said, "Well, I guess if you insist, I don't know what to do about this. All right." And they drowned him by pinning him under the water with a branch on his neck. So that's how Sabas became Saint Sabas the Goth. There is so much here that you can glean from this hagiography. Far from being at each other's throats, it seems that most of the Christians and pagans in that village were friendly with each other. In fact, the pagans were willing to risk their lives and their own safety by hiding the Christians. They did it several times. They lied to the authorities, even making sure the Christians could protect themselves by being seen to eat that sacrificial meat while not going against their religion. And we see a lot of solidarity here. And it goes against the narrative that Christians and pagans were at each other's throats in these communities. It just doesn't seem like that was the case, at least in these communities.
Yeah, of course, Sabas completely rejected the help of his pagan neighbors, even though they risked their safety to protect him. He yelled at his Christian neighbors for not being Christian enough. He had not just an all-consuming religious fervor, but as far as I can see, a contempt for the pagans around him and a sense of superiority over his own fellow Christians, too. But I find this depiction of leadership in Gothic communities at the ground level super fascinating. We have a powerful king, Alaric, and his agents, people like Winguric and Atharid, who come to communities to enact his law. And we see what happens when those laws are unpopular. People act in solidarity, quietly, for the benefit of the community as a whole. We have leaders at the local level willing to defy and resist. They don't do it overtly, but carefully through clever subterfuge, outright lying, and even hiding Christians. Again, probably at personal risk. It's quite possible that in unrecorded corners of Gothic kingdoms, in little farming villages, Christians and pagans may have gotten along and lived together peacefully and even protected each other when need be, no matter what wars were being fought by their kings far away.
But don't let this story fool you. Christianity liked to promote itself as a quote-unquote religion of peace. But in a lot of places in the Gothic and Roman territories, Christianity was violent. It was intolerant. It ripped through an ancient empire and destroyed thousands of years of art, history, and philosophy. And what occurred in its place was not an improvement. To many in the ancient world, the Christians were considered terrorists. The Arian Christians tended to be more tolerant than the Catholics.
Sort of, depending.
Yeah, the situation is complicated. The Catholics were the side that the Romans chose, and the one that eventually gained dominance before Catholicism and Christianity in general splintered in different directions. On a broader level, at the highest echelons of power, it was the divide between Goth and Roman, but also Arian and Catholic Christian, that weakened both the Ostrogothic and Visigothic kingdoms.
We can see that schism in the Ostrogothic kingdom, where by the end of it, as we've said many times, Catholics were fantasizing about dropping the Arian Christian king Theodoric the Great into a volcano when he died. But it was especially bad in the Visigothic kingdom. The Visigoths were the last Goths standing. Their kingdom lasted for several hundred years after the Ostrogothic kingdom fell. But that doesn't mean that they had their shit together, let's be clear. While they existed, their reign was often the most unstable, the different factions at each other's throats, fighting enemies from without and within. Christianity and the violent, intolerant nature of that Christianity played a part in that, and we will tell you that story in the next episode. So that's it for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next installment of this tale. In the meantime, you can find us online at Ancient History Fangirl on all the platforms. We're most active on Instagram at the moment. And you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. That's where you can get extra episodes, so you can hear us once a week on the Patreon. We also do videos. I've got a whole raft of audio episodes I'm going to record on different goth rabbit holes that I didn't get to go down in this extremely long season.
And I'm covering non-goth related things, so if you're missing stories not about the goths, come check us out.
That's right. So we have no Patreon members to thank this episode because we are not getting as many Patreon members as we usually did in years past. So if you guys want to support the podcast and keep us going, please do sign up because that is how we continue to do this work.
We know that times are tough and we appreciate you being able to support us and keep the podcast going. So if you're able, please sign up at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. Thank you all, and we will see you whenever we see you next. Hey everyone, it's Jen and Jenny here. And as an extra special treat, we're giving you an excerpt from the audiobook version of Jenny's novel, Enemy of My Dreams, narrated by the superb Lisa Flanagan.
This is the infamous tent scene. Well, one of them. There's actually 2 tent scenes, but the other one's kind of later on and it's a bit spoilery. So I love this scene so much because it's boozy and funny and kind of sexy, and it introduces some of the side characters that I love in this book, and I also love it because it's Julia trying to persuade Alaric to come over to her side and not give her away for ransom, and it goes awesome.
Julia's machinations go just as well as you'd expect.
I love that. And Lisa Flanagan does such a good job with this scene. She really makes it come alive, and I just get such a kick out of this scene, so I just had to share it with all of you. I love reading this scene at readings because it's just so entertaining. I mean, I'm entertained.
Are you not entertained?
The book and the audiobook and the ebook are all out in stores, and you can find them wherever books are sold.
Alaric thrust aside the door flap with one arm, staring with no small measure of astonishment down at the Princess Julia. She was staring up at him, swaying slightly on her feet and looking surprised to see him in his own damn tent. Alaric glanced at Riga, speaking in Gothic. How the hell did she get in here? Mystery to me. I think she's drunk. That much was certain. There was a fresh scent of wine on the woman's breath, and an unfocused look to her eyes that spoke of something more. Opium, maybe. He switched to her own imperial Latin. Hello, Julia. Send your men away, won't you? She looked at him beseechingly. The pitch-perfect tone of a manipulator in distress. What I have to say concerns your ears alone. Alaric gave her a particularly nasty smile. No. Clearly, people didn't tell her that very often. Julia's delicate jaw clenched and her eyes lit with temper. Have it your way. I'll say it right here. She raised her chin. You were talking to the wrong child of Theodosius at that banquet. I'm here to give you an empire. If Julia was capable of one thing in this world, it was holding her liquor. She'd drunk only enough to drown the fear, but now, craning her neck to meet the barbarian king's gaze, she realized too late that it hadn't worked. She was terrified. His eyes slid to her lips, and suddenly she was very aware of his nearness, in a way entirely different than fear. You have my attention, Julia. He gave her a mocking smile. He knew exactly the effect he had on her. Damn him. And crossed the tent, taking a seat in a battered camp chair. At his signal, one of his men brought her a 3-legged stool. Sit. She did. What is it you want? So blunt. If I was a man, I would be given all the courtesies. She needed wine of the non-drugged variety. That would calm her nerves. I believe it's customary to offer refreshment to a royal guest before negotiations. So we ought to negotiate now, he said softly. But to her surprise, he acquiesced. At another of his wordless signals, someone handed him a wineskin. Alaric poured some onto the ground, speaking in Gothic. Then he drank, muscles moving in the golden column of his throat. A tradition among my people, he told her solemnly, offering her the wineskin. We drink to Woden that he may grant us wise and fruitful conversation. Julia eyed what he offered with trepidation. She'd never drunk to honor a barbarian god. She wasn't sure such an action was entirely sanitary. But there was a challenge in Alaric's eyes. He didn't think she had the nerve. Julia snatched the wineskin with firm resolve. Wise and fruitful indeed, she said, smiling through her teeth. Then she put the wineskin to her lips and drank deep. Searing fire streaked down her throat. "Bloody hell!" she managed, bent in half by a fit of gasping coughs. "What in all that's holy is this?" Ialu, a liquor made from barley. He watched her struggle with cool dispassion. "If it is too strong for you, we have water." "A pox on your water!" She took another swallow. The bright, burning line lit up the inside of her throat again, but this time she was ready. The drink was good. The drink was what she needed. "Does she know she's supposed to sip it?" Riga asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "Perhaps we should tell her," Atolf mused, looking not the least inclined to do it. "We can't let her drink all of it. That's the last of the batch." Thorismund sounded distinctly irate. "If you pissweasels won't stop her, I will." "No." Alaric held up a hand. "Let her dig her own grave. Whatever she wanted, she seemed intent on making a fool of herself in getting it. Maybe she'd come to seduce him to her cause, he thought, eyes lazily tracing the fine lines of her collarbones. Maybe he'd let her try. "You've had your drink." Custom demanded they pass the skin back and forth between them, taking small sips as offer met with counteroffer. Julia gave no sign she intended to pass it back. "Now speak." Her voice dropped low, the affected purr of a gifted seductress. "You plan to ransom me, but I have a better proposition. We share the same enemy, my brother. Put me on his throne and you can have any land you want. Point to a place on a map and it's yours." Not a chance. He had been betrayed for the last time by Theodosius and his children. "Put you on the throne." Alaric struggled not to laugh. "You!" She frowned. "You laugh because I was born a woman. I laugh because you were born a lapdog. Perhaps I should let my people bleed and die to raise one of your brother's peacocks to the purple. It makes just as much sense." The look she gave him could freeze fire. "They're cockerels." "I wonder," he mused lazily. "What would drive an emperor's sister to slip me a knife in the middle of a battle and engineer her own kidnapping?" "You've met my promised husband, Olympius," she said coolly. "I loathe the very ground he stands on." She meant it well enough. The venom in her voice was real. So the woman was running away from her engagement. "And what is this to do with me?" "Honorius ordered me to marry him. The only way to argue with Honorius is with an army at my back." She raised her eyes, blue-green and fierce as a cat in a trap. "Your army." Julia took another hard slug from the wineskin. If she just kept drinking, she could be Cleopatra. "You will need allies when the time comes," she informed the barbarian warlord who was currently glaring at her in an intimidating fashion. "No one knows the snake pit of Roman politics like I do. You cannot hold Rome by force of arms alone. Take it, maybe, but not hold it." "Who says I want to hold it? Maybe I just want to see it burn." He bared his teeth in a brutal smile. "Grow up, woman. What does it matter if you hate your husband? Marriage does not follow love. It never has. You'd be less of a fool to lie on your back as you were made to do." Julia bristled. A searing flush swept across her body, bright heat just beneath the skin. Outrage choked her throat. The nerve. "How far down the peninsula do you think you'll get without support from at least some of the people?" she snapped. "Not everyone in Rome is happy at my brother's rise. I could lend your next invasion legitimacy." Somehow her tongue got tangled over the word. "And beyond that, money. I have a fortune in villas all up and down the coast. All yours, King of the Goths." She let out a hiccup. When had there become two of him? "I think I should sit down." Alaric's reply seemed to come from the bottom of a well. Julia barely heard. Slowly, she slid off the chair and onto the bearskin rug. Alaric watched the princess slide off the stool and list onto the bearskin like a sinking ship. That last pull from the wineskin had been the one that broke her. He could not trust a thing she said, of course. She was a daughter of Theodosius. She'd shred any agreement the moment it suited her. Even so, he wanted her. Even now. "You're already sitting." She ignored that. He knelt beside her and offered her water, which she regarded with scorn. "I'd be emperor already if I were a man," she declared accusingly. "Certainly," he drawled. "Drink." She took the water skin. Up close she smelled of ialu and sweat, and beneath it the intoxicating scent of roses. She took a sip and grimaced. "This is water." He laughed. "And what else should it be?" She stared up at him as if just realizing he was there. Eyes green as gemstones one moment, dark blue the next, like the sea over a vast crevasse. "What else do you want from me, King of the Goths?" Her lush red lips curved in a drowsy, knowing smile. Her hand rested boldly on his arm. A scorching burn. Fuck. He'd put her in the farthest tent from his. He'd been scrupulously careful. "Do you even know what you're offering, Julia?" She let the sentence fall away, her mouth a breath from his, begging to be plundered. Fuck it. He could send his men away, then press her back on this bearskin and take what she offered. He would make her sob for him. It would be his own kind of revenge. "I believe I shall take a nap," the Princess Julia announced to the room at large, fingers curling in the bearskin. "I am indisposed. You may all come back later. Come back tomorrow." Then she lay down on her side on Alaric's bearskin rug and let out a particularly loud snork. For a breath, quiet reigned in his tent. "Well," Riga said cheerfully. "Now what?" "Let's have a bit of fun with her," Thorismund growled. "Show her the consequences of drinking the last of a man's batch." "Maybe tie her to a stake outside," Riga said agreeably. "Leave her for the beasts." "Not one of you touches her." Alaric spoke softly but with a force that shut them up. The edge of her stola rode up her perfect leg, and he took off his cloak to cover her. There was a thin line of drool dangling from her mouth now. Drool. Alaric shook his head in disgust. He didn't even like this woman. "We cannot take her," Atolf said. "She's a distraction." Alaric glanced pointedly at Atolf's new lover, the Gothic ex-slave with the calculating eyes who had stayed conspicuously quiet. "As if you don't have your own distractions." "Do you honestly think the Romans will bargain for her? She's defied her own brother." "They'll bargain," Alaric said. "The boy emperor can't afford to look so weak as to have his kin kidnapped out from under him." He lifted his eyes to the twins, who had come bursting into the tent just now. He hadn't the patience for whatever elaborate excuse they'd no doubt invented to explain their failure to keep the princess confined. "Take her back to the tent," he ordered them before they could say a word. He would deal with them later. Then he called his men around him and bent over the maps, the plan for their escape already building in his mind.